Hey, this is Stephan, author of the Great World History book, and today we're going to talk about the life of Ibn Sina, the great Persian philosopher of the 10th century, from a time period known as the Islamic Golden Age, a time period that is often overlooked, and I think it shouldn't be. So let's dig right in. So first, some background information about the time period. After the collapse of the Roman Empire, Western Europe dropped into an age of darkness from which it would only recover in the High Middle Ages. Yet the intellectual tradition of Greece and Rome didn't completely vanish. It moved eastward to the Islamic world, where from the 8th century BC, both art and science flourished. This new movement was centered around the capital city of the Islamic Empire, the Islamic Caliphate, known as Baghdad. And in a short period of time, Baghdad became the economic, cultural, and intellectual center of the world. And this time period is called the Islamic Golden Age. During this period, scholars from very diverse backgrounds, Arabs, Persians, Indians, Christians, Jews, and so on, went to Baghdad and other cities in the Islamic Caliphate, where they translated the Greek texts into Arabic and thereby preserving these texts from extinction. But the Arabs did more than just preserve knowledge. They also invented the rules of algebra, created sophisticated water-powered machines, learned to distill alcohol, and much more. Interestingly, and likely surprising to many, the intellectual tradition of the Islamic Golden Age even allowed for dissenting thought, including strong critiques of religion, of revealed religion, in favor of logic and reason. And here we see a beautiful 13th century drawing of scholars working in one of the libraries of Baghdad. Many of the greatest minds of the Islamic Golden Age were polymaths, so they were skilled at many different fields, and among the most influential of them was Ibn Sina. And by the way, the name Ibn Sina during the Middle Ages was westernized in Western Europe into Avicenna. So if you read about Western history, the Middle Ages, and even the Renaissance, the name Avicenna will pop up once in a while. Just so you know that this also refers to the great Ibn Sina himself. So being a polymath, where did he specialize in? Well, Ibn Sina was a master in philosophy, medicine, astronomy, alchemy, geography, geology, theology, logic, mathematics, physics, poetry, and the list goes on. He wrote approximately 450 titles, short works, of which about half survive. By the way, many of these works are not translated into English yet, and even the works that are translated into English are hard to get. It is a bit frustrating the lack of interest there is into preserving these great works of knowledge. Think about how many times Shakespeare has been translated into all the languages of the world, but there isn't as much interest to preserve and spread these great Arabic Islamic works. And here we have one drawing that's supposed to represent Ibn Sina. We have no better drawings depicting him, unfortunately, from the time period. So what did Ibn Sina do? Well, his main achievement was probably his Canon of Medicine, which became a standard medical textbook of the medieval world, containing an overview of all the important medical knowledge that was available at the time. Interestingly, it was still used in European universities as late as the 17th century. So that's an incredible achievement. Another important work was the Book of Healing, which doesn't deal with medicine, as though it seems to be about medicine. Instead, it is about how to cure an ignorant soul. It is concerned with logic, science, mathematics, metaphysics, so on, mainly the work of Aristotle. Interestingly, in this book, he also made an attempt to prove the existence of a soul separate from the body. To modern standards, it doesn't count as a full proof, but it's an interesting thought experiment nonetheless. So let's go through it. Imagine a human being is created at an instant, with his limbs separated. And he does not see them, he cannot touch them, and they do not touch each other. And he hears no sound. He would be ignorant of the existence of his whole organs. but he would know the existence of his individual being as one thing, while being ignorant of all other things. So the idea is as follows. If you could deprive a human being of all sensory experience, would it still know that it is a human being? And Ibn Sina thinks this is the case. While in modern psychology, we believe that the idea of a self, of an individual, can only be formed in interaction with the world and other human beings. So that's why his reasoning is flawed. But it is very interesting from a historical perspective on studying, thinking about the difference between body and soul. In the Book of Healing, Ibn Sina also corrects an error in Aristotle's physics, which would become very, very important for the later development of Newtonian mechanics. Allow me to quickly explain the error and Ibn Sina's contribution to solving it. Aristotle believed that all earthly objects have an inherent tendency, an inherent nature, to first fall downward to the floor and then to come to a standstill. That is what objects seem to do when you simply observe objects around you. However, this turned out false. Because if we throw an object upwards and it leaves our hand, it still continues to move upward for a bit until it falls down. This contradicts Aristotle's earlier claim that objects had the inherent nature to fall downward. In that case, you would expect the moment the object leaves your hand, it would immediately drop down again. This doesn't happen. Aristotle tried to solve this problem by claiming that when the object moves upwards, it leaves a vacuum behind it, which is actually the case. That is true. And then he claimed air would rush in to fill up that vacuum, which also happens. But then he went astray, believing that that air would give the object that extra push that explains why it would move upward for a bit until its nature takes over and it finally falls down. This was a very, very clever idea, but it turned out to be wrong. And although it might sound like an inconsequential idea, it kept thinkers from creating an accurate theory of motion, which finally happened in the 17th century with Isaac Newton. So what was Ibn Sina's contribution? Ibn Sina believed that objects do not come to a halt by themselves, as Aristotle had claimed, but only when acted upon by external forces. Without gravity, he claimed, an object thrown upwards would continue moving upwards indefinitely. But since gravity does exist, it slows the object down first, and then it pushes it downward. This is a very different way of looking at motion and at force, and it was one of the in-between points between the theory of Aristotle and the later theory of Newton. Like many of the great thinkers of the Islamic Golden Age, Ibn Sina was also heavily influenced by Aristotle's work on logic. Following Aristotle, he also claimed that God was the driving force behind the motion in the universe. Aristotle describes this in his work called Metaphysics. I have another video on this on my channel. But Aristotle also believed that God did not concern himself with particular events or particular individuals. He just was the source of the motion of the universe. This, of course, is in contrast with the claims from the Abrahamic religion. So, for instance, the Quran, which claims that God does know individual human beings. Ibn Sina also wrote one of the first autobiographies in world history. And his autobiography is known as The Life of Ibn Sina. In this short work, it takes only an hour or so to read, and I advise you to do so. He records his achievements with a confidence in his intellect that is typical for the great thinkers of the Islamic age. It must be surprising to many given the current state of the Middle East. At the start of the work, he boasts that he read the Quran and many other works of literature by the age of only 10 years old. While studying Aristotelian logic, we read, he quickly even outsmarted his own teacher. We read, my master was extremely amazed at me. Whatever problem he posed, I conceptualized better than he. So he advised my father against my taking up any occupation other than learning. I continued until I had read the simple parts of logic under him. but as for its deeper intricacies, he had no knowledge of them. And we continue. So I began to read the texts and study the commentaries by myself until I had mastered logic. As for Euclid, the great Greek mathematician, I read the first 5 or 6 figures under his tutelage, but I undertook the solution of the rest of the book in its entirety by myself, so his teacher couldn't help him any further. Then I moved on to the Almagest. The Almagest is the great work of astronomy. I did a lecture about it last week. And when I had finished its introductory sections and got to the geometrical figures, my master Al-Natili said to me, quote, "Take over reading and solving them by yourself, then show them to me so that I can explain to you what is right and what is wrong." But the man did not attempt to deal with the text, so I deciphered it myself. And many a figure he did not grasp until I put it before him and made him understand it. Then Al-Natili left me. And he continues, I devoted myself to studying the texts, the original and the commentaries, in the natural sciences and metaphysics. And the gates of knowledge began opening for me. Interestingly, all the texts he mentions here, the Quran, some texts by Aristotle, Euclid, the Almagest, they're all books that I have in my bookcase as well. They're all timeless classics. Very interesting how a bookcase cannot change that much for 1,000 years. We continue. Next, I sought to know medicine, and so I read the books written on it. Medicine is not one of the difficult sciences, and therefore I excelled at it in a very short time, to the point that distinguished physicians began to read the science of medicine under me. I cared for the sick, and there opened to me some of the doors of medical treatment that are indescribable and can be learned only from practice. So he became a skilled practitioner as well. We continue. At night I would return home, set out a lamp before me, and devote myself to reading and writing. Whenever sleep overcame me, or I became conscious of weakening, I would turn aside to drink a cup of wine so that my strength would return to me, and then I would return to reading. So a very disciplined, very ambitious person. And whenever sleep seized me, I would see those very problems in my dreams, and many questions became clear to me in my sleep. I continued in this until all the sciences were deeply rooted within me, and I understood them as far as is humanly possible. After Ibn Sina cured a sultan of a disease, he was enrolled in his service, and one day he asked permission to go to the sultan's library, and this is what he saw. And before I continue, remember that books were very valuable and very rare at the time. To have access to such a beautiful collection was totally remarkable at the time. We quote, "He gave me permission and I was admitted to a building which had many rooms. In each room there were chests of books piled on top of each other. In one of the rooms were books on the Arabic language and poetry, in another on jurisprudence, and likewise in each room were books on a single science. So I looked through the catalogues of books by the ancients and asked for whichever one I needed. I saw books whose names had not reached very many people, and which I had not seen before that time, nor have I seen since. I read these books and mastered what was useful in them, and discovered the status of each man in his science. So when I had reached the age of 18, I was finished with all of these sciences." So that was it for today. I hope that with these quotes you've gained an insight into how vibrant and confident that time period of the Islamic Golden Age actually was. And I hope I see you soon when I post another lecture. See you soon.